horrific scenes coming out of Dagestan in Russia. Let's go ahead and play some of this video that has come out. This is from an airport, as I said, in Dagestan. It's actually in southern Dagestan, where a full-fledged riot broke out after some leaked reports on Telegram informed the population that some passengers may be arriving at the airport from Israel, and so therefore might be Jewish. A full-fledged, and I don't think you can really call it anything else, basically attempted pogrom, broke out. Here you have an instance where one of the individuals was pulled off of the plane and they're asking him questions and they're like, you have to wait here until we make a decision. He's trying to tell these people, he's like, I'm not Jewish, I'm not from Israel, I'm freaking Uzbek. He's an Uzbekistani, or was an Uzbek resident coming to Dagestan. Wow. For those who don't understand, Dagestan, we were trying to talk about the way to contextualize it. Most Americans probably first heard of it after the Boston bombing. Those two brothers, the Tsarnaev brothers, were both Dagestani. You might have heard some of their citizens are very, very good in the UFC. But Dagestan is a very interesting place. And even in saying it's Russia is like, kind of. It's part of Russia, but it's kind of one of those areas with a very distinct ethnic history, long been part of the Russian Empire, but heavily Islamic population, very, very fundamentalist, especially in recent times. They kind of have a détente peace with the Moscow government, but the governmental structure is very similar to like Chechnya, where they have like armed warlords and all of that, but they're allied with the Kremlin. They get to do what they want. Moscow only troubles them if they start embarrassing them or like doing terrorism, like this. Yeah, I'm sure you can expect a full-scale crackdown after this one. So currently, 20 people, including police officers, were injured. I mean, the crazy part of it really is just that they completely stormed the airport. The security authorities were totally overwhelmed almost immediately. The Kremlin spokesperson said on Monday that they blamed, quote, outside interference for the riots. Krystal, we have some information on that, and they cited, though, no evidence to that. However, they are saying that this is, quote, Western attempts to use the events in the Middle East to sow discord in Russian society. But unfortunately, it highlights one of the ugliest things about the Russian Empire historically, which is it is the site of some of the worst pogroms against Jews in all of history. If you meet Americans, especially Jewish Americans whose roots go back to the 1900s, 9 out of 10 times, including many good friends of mine, their families were fleeing pogroms in Poland, in Ukraine, in Dagestan, all across this. Dagestan in particular, they used to have a pretty thriving Jewish population, gone, just completely, driven out. Israel actually has many Russians who came to Israel after the fall of the Soviet Union, just because they'd experienced such horrific anti-Semitism. So this is a very, very ugly thing that the world is getting to view. I mean, from someone like me and many others, like you read about these things, the pogrom of 1906 or whatever. But it's like when you see something like this just break out, it's a horrible reminder of what straight up ethnic violence looks like. And every time you do, it's just like the most hideous and ugly thing. Imagine searching passengers to see if they're Jewish, to try and kill them. I mean, that's what they want. They wanted to lynch them.
It is. Yeah. I mean, there are no words for it. It's crazy. Just unbelievable to watch that mob mentality take hold and, surging through the airport and surrounding the plane and searching the passengers for passports. And this was ongoing for hours. Yeah. Complete insanity. You were talking a little bit about Dagestan. I was trying to also get some context from our friend Yegor about this. I mean, basically the idea is like this is a relatively poor region. It's actually very beautiful on the Caspian Sea, but relatively poor. And, poor in the context of Russia, which is much poorer than in the context of the United States. Very religious and very conservative. So that's effectively, the fundamentalists who are storming this plane and inciting these mobs and this riot. It's also worth noting that Dagestan was actually the only region in Russia that really violently protested against conscription to be involved in the Ukrainian war. And because of that, there were all of these sort of like information operations coming from the Ukrainian side to try to sow that discontent and make the most of it. And so when they're saying, oh, this was like Western influenced, that's what they're talking about. And I'll read to you from the New York Times what they've been able to suss out about the origin of these calls, because a mob doesn't just appear out of nowhere. They were following directions and instructions and information about, hey, this plane from Israel is landing here and here's what you should go and do. So local authorities in Dagestan blamed extremist outlets administered by Russian enemies for inciting the unrest. Some of the protests were supported by a Telegram channel linked to a former Russian lawmaker, Ilya Ponomaryov, who had fled to Ukraine and has become a staunchly anti-Kremlin politician. He basically fled because he was in trouble for corruption, et cetera. So he goes to Ukraine and has been helping out the Ukrainians with these efforts to sow discontent within Russia. Plans to catch the passengers of the incoming flight were shared on that Telegram channel associated with that dude, along with screenshots of the flight schedule on Saturday and Sunday. Local religious figures in the North Caucasus have condemned the clashes. But so that's the connection that they're pointing to, is that this guy who's an anti-Kremlin dissident who works with the Ukrainian government, it was a Telegram channel affiliated with him that basically like stoked and helped to spark this mob violence.
Wow, inside Ukraine, huh? What's that about? Interesting.
Just telling you what the New York Times is reporting.
Right. Don't
here.
blame us for reporting that. But look, it illustrates something which we were able to talk about eventually in a mainstream conversation. There is a lot of Nazi-affiliated anti-Semitism inside of the former Soviet Union, and they find themselves, I guess, temporary allies with straight-up Islamic fundamentalists in places like Dagestan, and it's so deeply disturbing, and it highlights the absolute worst of Russian history of state-sponsored pogroms of Jewish residents. So I know a lot of Jews were just absolutely shocked, and I think really traumatized because, and I saw many people saying, like my great-great-grandfather was killed in a pogrom in Ukraine or in what was at the time the Russian Empire, and this is, just gives me a flashback to what that is like, and I honestly cannot imagine. I just think it is so horrifying to watch. The Russian authorities almost certainly going to crack down. That is one thing we should talk about. Everyone was interpreting this to like, oh, if this was an anti-Ukraine protest or Ukraine war protest, they would have immediately done something. I'm like, I am not reading this as state-sponsored. Like, I'm reading this as the Dagestanis got out of control and now they've embarrassed the entire nation of Russia, and they are about to have the wrath of the Kremlin and Moscow brought down upon them for humiliating them in the eyes of the world.
I don't really see an interest this serves the Russian government. I mean, listen, maybe somebody can make the case for me, but I don't see the interest that they would have.
They are anti-Semitic. I mean, or mostly. They're very Greek Orthodox or the Russian Orthodox and very Orthodox, like in an exclusionary way. Jews in Russia have never been fully accepted as citizens despite their propaganda purposes. So it's one of those where it's been simmering below the surface, but something like this is very, very ugly. And we also wanted to highlight, some other ethnic tension and violence, which, again, this really connects back to what we started our A block with, which is, unfortunately, the more that this is framed as some sort of religious holy war, people in those religions are going to basically heed that call and treat it
act like it's a freaking religious holy war.
And to give an example, let's put this one up there on the screen. This was happening outside of Netanya College, which is a dorm in Jerusalem that was housing Arab students, and some very hard right, Israeli citizens gathered outside and started chanting, death to Arabs. And the protesters, they claim that the Arab students had disrupted their prayers at a Chabad synagogue by hurling eggs at worshipers and playing loud Arab music. So in the evening, they decided that they were going to take retaliation and say that they were going to gather around that. The authorities had to break up all of this and, allegations about eggs being thrown and all this. But this is the simmering hatred that has been now in Jerusalem for quite some time, and then the war and the backdrop of that is making things so much worse. I don't know. I really feel despair. We've talked about last time around about the most pessimistic solution, or the most pessimistic outcome is the most likely. And this is a key part of that. It was one of the worst periods of the Iraq War, was not just watching American soldiers, die for basically nothing. It was really to watch the full-scale outbreak of sectarian conflict, of Sunnis and Shias like killing each other in the streets in some of the most savage and horrific way possible. And now, you're watching this and you can only think if this Israeli operation lasts months and then whatever the hell the political fallout on all that is going to look like. How many more scenes are we going to see like this? People deserve to be safe wherever they are. And it's really horrible to watch.
I was struck by what we interviewed the host of the Martyr Made podcast, this long podcast about the history of Zionism, the history of this conflict, very in-depth, very thoughtfully done. And I know a lot of you all appreciate that interview that we did, as I did. And he wrote in response to what happened in Dagestan, "This is disgusting. It is also an example of why Israel must find a way to make peace and resolve the Palestinian conflict. Prior Israeli governments worked hard, along with their Palestinian Authority counterparts, for peace. But Likud, that's Netanyahu's party, has shown no more interest in peace than Hamas. Netanyahu stated openly he prefers to keep the conflict at a low boil while settlers continue to occupy the West Bank to make a two-state solution impossible. This is not to say, because I know some are already typing this response, that Israel is to blame for incidents like this. But incidents like this will never stop unless there is a just peace with the Palestinians. The Israeli government has an obligation not only to its own citizens, but to Jews around the world to stop pursuing a policy that can only intensify hatred and conflict. There is no way to fix this with bullets." And, I think that is very carefully worded and true. I mean, these sorts of horrors beget more horrors. And that's the unfortunate reality of human nature, of world history. I mean, how many times do we have to see this play out? And what the Israeli government is doing in Gaza right now, let's be honest, this is not going to make Israelis or Jewish people around the world safer. If anything, and not just if anything, very likely, if not, totally 100% reality, they are sowing the seeds of more radicalism. They are creating more terrorists. And not Netanyahu, especially with his sectarian holy war language, is making horrific mob scenes like this much more likely to unfold around the world. So this is the sort of stuff that they're playing with here. And I think Daryl also did a great job of talking about the fact that at its core, this isn't a religious conflict. It's a conflict over land. It's a political conflict over land. However, when you overlay it with religious justification, when you're talking about we're the people of the light and they're the people of the darkness, the direct quote from Netanyahu of how he's framing this conflict, think of what sort of things that justifies. And this is something we'll talk to Li Fong about today too. When you believe God is on your side, when you believe your actions must be righteous because they are coming out of your religious context. And, when you have a lot of fundamentalists on both sides of this, this is how these things can spiral completely out of control. And so when I see what happened at that airport, I think that is the tiniest glimpse of where we could ultimately end up with these things spiraling.
Yeah, it's very important. And look, nobody is saying it's like, oh, if they do this, and this is just, no one's justifying anything. But we live in reality. We know that these types of things are only more likely to occur as the violence escalates. And, that is that is really sobering, as always, just to be reminded of what that looks like. And I think it's really unfortunate. I think it's horrible, and I really hope that we don't see any more of it. And yet I think we should all steel ourselves for the unfortunate reality that we'll probably see more.
Indeed. Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.